everyone to today's session on the topic of taking responsibility in our conversation circle, Gems from the Wisdom Traditions. We feel very honored to have joining us today Professor Frank Perkins of UH Manila, and he is the editor of the journal Philosophy East and West. He is the author of a number of books, and you probably received a quote from his most recent book that deals with Menzi. He has been teaching and conducting research in Asia. He's taught in many places. In DePaul University, he was the director of the Chinese Studies program. So he's eminently qualified to speak with us on this historical Confucian teacher, Menzi. And I'd like to welcome Frank to give us a little food for thought here.
Thank you. I will, thank you, Renee, for inviting me, and also David for suggesting this. David was in my Chinese philosophy class maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. And so we met through that, and I gave a little talk on Menzi here maybe a year and a half ago or something like that. And it was fun. So I look forward to it again. Given that the idea is the gems from the wisdom tradition, I'll try to present some quotations from Menzi, and I'll give you some content, some explanation, but then we can talk about them afterwards and if you have questions about them. So kind of let him speak for himself a little bit, but I'll give some context around it. And Renee said not to speak more than 15 or 20 minutes, which I thought will be fine. And then I was reading through what I wanted to do, and I was at like 30 minutes. And I was like, okay, this is crazy. So I've cut it out. I will not speak more than 20 minutes for sure. But I might just read through some quotations at the end without a lot of explanation. We'll see how the timing goes. Before that, let me just to give a little bit of context. So I put a little image of the book here. Most of the stuff that I've written is coming out of pretty like academic concerns. And this book is much more personal to me because I really wrote it. I actually started it more than 20 years ago, trying to write something that would convey Menzi's view of activism to a general audience. So what I'm really interested in Menzi is his way of thinking about dedicating your life to making the world a better place. So not just minimally like being a good person, but actively trying to think, how can we make the world better? And I think that's the essence of Confucian philosophy, not just his philosophy, but Confucian philosophy. And what's interesting about it partly is that he mixes together theory. So he has the theory of human nature most famously, but also practical advice. And all the Confucians do this. So they have just a lot of good practical sayings, right, that are useful to think about. In terms of the theory, what I like the most is that he's trying to think about really dedicating your life to, again, to making things better, but not thinking about that in terms of self-sacrifice, but rather thinking of that in terms of extending what we actually care about. So that's the title, to Doing What You Really Want. That's what he wants to argue, at least, is that this is what we really want if we really think about what we most deeply want. So this is what attracted me to Menzi and what I was trying to convey in this book, to try to make it kind of practical and accessible. So I'm happy to talk about it. So responsibility is a clear part of that. And I don't want to give a lot of context around Chinese philosophy. A lot of you are somewhat familiar with Chinese philosophy already, and it would take too much time. But I just note for Menzi and these early Chinese thinkers, they have a very this worldly view. And what I mean by that is they don't have any concern with an afterlife. I don't think he believes there is an afterlife, but in any case, he doesn't pay any attention to afterlife. He doesn't think there's any alternative to this world. So there's not something like nirvana or moksha or something different from this world. And he doesn't think that there's a kind of conscious, deliberate God who's controlling things. And so one consequence of this for him and for most early Chinese philosophers is this sense that, if things are going to be better, we have to do it. There's no one else to rely on other than human beings. And there's no higher thing we're trying to reach. Like, we're just trying to make this world we're in better. And that then connects to this idea of responsibility. So really Menzi's view is we're the only ones who can be responsible. There's no one else to be responsible. And so it has to fall on us. And so this is where the idea of responsibility comes in. For just very briefly, who is Menzi, right? So he's, I would say, the most influential Confucian philosopher. So Confucius himself is the most influential, but he mostly gave short little sayings. And oh, sorry, I better note down the time so I don't go too long. The theory behind it was largely developed by Menzi, who was maybe 100 years after Confucius. And what did he actually do? He tried to persuade political rulers to take up his philosophy. So he was trying to actually promote policies that would help the people and decrease war. He wasn't that successful with that. And so his real influence was he had a lot of followers and he taught. And so he taught a lot of people who then had more influence. He's most famous for his claim that human nature is good, or really that human beings tend toward being good. And I'll say a little bit about that today. The last time I was here, I think I talked more about that point, but that's his most famous claim. And we know his philosophy primarily from a book that we call the Menzi, which has a bunch of short dialogues with him, and sometimes with rulers, sometimes with his students, his disciples, sometimes with a kind of political rival or a philosophical rival that he's debating with. So this is where we get his philosophy from. In terms of responsibility, I want to start with these two quotations, but I actually want to just talk a little bit about this idea of taking responsibility first, because it's a really great phrase to think about, and particularly in thinking about taking responsibility as in contrast to just being responsible, right? Or just saying responsibility, because I think being responsible we could think of as a question of facts, and we could argue about it. So someone could say, look, well, this is your responsibility, or I could say, like, no, this isn't my responsibility, this is your fault. Or sometimes it's a matter of we agree to take on a certain kind of responsibility, and then we can say, yeah, okay, this is your responsibility because you said you were going to do this. So it's a matter of fact, and it's a matter of sort of causality, who causes something or not. But taking responsibility is a much more interesting idea because it's an active stance, and it doesn't necessarily go with the facts. So most often when we want to tell someone to take responsibility, it's because we think they are responsible, but they're not taking the responsibility. So what they're taking as their responsibility isn't corresponding to the actual facts of their responsibility. I think it can go the other way as well. And I think that's what Menzi is getting at in these quotations, is that we can talk about being responsible for things that aren't in fact really our responsibility, but we can take responsibility. I'm not sure about that, but this would be something I'd be interested to hear what people think about it. And even like, what does it really mean when we say to take responsibility? So it's a commitment, right? When I say I'll be responsible for that, I mean I'll take care of whatever comes up with that. You can depend on me, right? It's a commitment. It's a little different though, I think, from just saying I'll take care of it, because when I say I'll take responsibility, it feels to me like I'm taking that thing and making it part of myself in some way, right? I'm like incorporating it into me. I'm taking not possession of it in some way, but maybe possession of it in some way. We could say to take ownership of something is to take responsibility for it even. So it's linking myself to that thing. And it's interesting just to think about that. And again, I'd be happy to hear what other people think about this question of what it really means to take responsibility. But one clear aspect of it that Menzi cares about is it's closely connected to action. So if I say I'll take responsibility for that, what I mean is that I will do what's necessary for that thing, right? So I'm committing to certain actions, but also when we feel responsible for something, when we take responsibility, we feel more motivated to do it. And so in the past few weeks, thinking about what I want to talk about with this, I was talking with my wife, and she teaches 4th grade, and she was having her students discuss ethical dilemmas. And one of the things she had them discuss was, what's your responsibility to pick up trash that's not your trash? So the kids were discussing this, and mostly they said, of course, you should pick up trash that's not your trash. But thinking about it, I thought, if I drop something, I will immediately try to pick it up, right? I feel responsible for it. And I will, if I drop something and the wind blows it away, I will chase after it to get it. If it's not my trash, I don't feel responsible in the same way. And the reality is a lot of times I won't even pick it up, right? But even if I do, I feel like I'm doing something really exceptionally good if I'm picking up someone else's trash. Whereas if it's mine, I just feel like that's just the minimum of being a decent person. You have to pick up your own trash, And I thought there's something really almost absurd about, like, say, running down the beach to grab your plastic bag that's blowing away and running past other pieces of trash that are just sitting there, right? But like, you don't care about those pieces of trash because they're not your piece of trash, right? So there's weird about this, right? That I was thinking about this just from talking with my wife about it, and how her students are thinking about it. So these two statements from Menzi, I think this gives some context for them. So I'll read through them. So you saw someone in the world drowning as if he himself were drowning them. G saw someone in the world starving as if he himself were starving them. This is why they had such urgency. The second one, he says, when Yi Yin thought of the people of the world, if there was one man or woman who did not receive the nurturing kindness of a Yao or Shun, it was like he himself shoved them into a ditch. This is the weight of taking the world as one's own responsibility. So in all these cases, Menzi is making a kind of contrast between the first case, where he thinks any normal person is going to feel some sense of urgency and responsibility. So if I bump into someone and they fall off the path into a ditch, I will immediately feel like I need to help that person. I need to apologize. I need to make up for it. It's hard to imagine the first cases, but if I bump someone and they fall into a pool and they can't get out, of course I would feel like I have to help them. In the second cases, we might still help, but I think it's pointed, we don't feel the same sense of urgency, right? Because there are lots of people who are in trouble in the world, right? We don't feel like that's our responsibility. We don't take responsibility for that. But if we do it, then we take responsibility for it. So what distinguishes these three guys, so these were three of like the great contributors to Chinese society in his mind, like three of the sages. So Yu was famous for solving the flooding problems by dredging rivers and building dams and building channels. So that's why it talks about drowning for him. Ji is Ho Ji, who was the inventor of agriculture. So that's why it talks about with starvation with him. This guy Yi Yin is less famous, but he was the main kind of architect behind the rise of the second main Chinese dynasty, the Xia dynasty. So that was Emperor Tang was the founder of the Xia dynasty, but Yi Yin was his minister who helped him bring it about and restore order and peace. So what distinguishes them is that they take responsibility for more than normal people take responsibility for, right? And this is the key then for them saving the world in Menzi's terms. So a few interesting points out of this. One is that I don't think Menzi is looking at like, what's the facts about responsibility here? So you could make an argument that, if anybody's drowning, we're responsible for that because everything is interconnected, right? So you'll see Buddhists will sometimes make that argument that any suffering in the world, ultimately I bear some responsibility for because everything is interconnected. Thich Nhat Hanh's little book on the Heart Sutra has a really great description of that. But I don't think that's Menzi's point. And I think that's a kind of hard argument to make, that I really have a causal responsibility for anything that happens to anyone. He's looking at how do you motivate people to change the world. And he's thinking if you can get people to take responsibility, regardless of the facts, right, that will motivate them to do these kinds of actions. And what you need is at least some people like these people who took responsibility for everything, right? They took the burdens of the world on their back, you could say, and acted with that same kind of intense urgency that we would feel if we hurt someone. They acted that way toward anyone who was suffering. The second kind of minor point that is interesting to me is that Menzi doesn't present this as like a conclusion that they draw. They think, oh, okay, I'm responsible for everything, so I should help everyone. It's an immediate way of seeing things. The Chinese word he uses there is I translate it as saw in one case and think in the other case, but it means to like perceive something in a certain way. And if you think about if we, accidentally bump someone and knock them over, we respond like immediately spontaneously to that situation to try to help them. We don't like reason it out. What's my moral duty here or something like that? Like this is just how we immediately encounter the world. And that's the case for these sages, right? They immediately, when they see someone in trouble, they respond to it with that kind of intensity in this kind of spontaneous way. And this is Menzi's goal ultimately. So the goal for a good person is not just to do the right thing, but to see the world in the right way, to respond in the right way and spontaneously help. The third thing to emphasize out of this is that there's an underlying implied, I think, optimistic point here, which is that for a regular person, if they knock someone into a ditch, they would care about it and they would do something to fix it. Just like if I somehow accidentally caused someone to fall into a water where they couldn't swim, I would help them, right? I would feel like I needed to help them. So underlying it is a sense that, we do we do care about things. We are motivated to help people. We are motivated to take responsibility. Amongst his account, it's just not enough. We need to extend that out further to more and more people. And that's the tricky thing for him. So this is where his idea of human nature being good comes in. And I don't want to say too much about that, but I put part of one passage here. This was like probably the passage I focused on most the last time I talked here. Is Mengzi says, if in what people desire there was nothing greater than life, then if there were anything they could do to attain life, they would do it. If in what people hate there were nothing greater than death, then if there were anything they could do to avoid death, they would do it. Yet there are cases in which one could live, but some means are not used, or one could avoid death, but some things are not done. Thus, having what one desires more than life and having what one hates more than death. It is not only worthies that have this heart, all people have it. Worthies are able to not lose it. So this is one of my favorite passages from Menzi, and there's a lot that I could say about it. The key point he's trying to make there is that even for regular people, there are certain things that they would refuse to do, even if refusing to do them meant that they would not survive. So the clearest examples he gives are ones involving family, right? So cases where we wouldn't harm our family in order to, even if that was the only way to stay alive, were to harm our family, we wouldn't do it, right? And in fact, lots of times people would risk their lives for their family. But he also thinks we would do this for a child we don't know, a child that we see in danger, for commitments to moral ideals, out of loyalty, like lots of kinds of things like this. So he doesn't necessarily mean that every single person would do this. And he doesn't mean that we would do this in a lot of circumstances. But his point, what he wants to say is that there are, for regular human psychology, there are things we actually care about more than our own convenience, our own pleasure, and even our own lives. And that's the basic idea that human nature is good. That's really what he means. He recognizes we actually have a lot of bad tendencies too. But he thinks when it comes down to it, like our deepest priority is going to be our connections with other people, and that we would even, in some cases, die rather than violate those beliefs or those commitments. So that leads to a key question for Menzi, right? And I think a very interesting question, but not one that philosophers necessarily talk about very much, but is, why is it that many of us would risk our lives in like a crucial, situation to help people, but we won't actually help people that much in our normal day-to-day lives? Like, why is it that, if my, the building were on fire, I would help my neighbor get out, even if it was some risk to me, but I'm annoyed if I've got to help my neighbor like carry their trash or something, right? Like, this doesn't make any sense. So why does this happen? So Menzi gives a lot of different reasons for it. And it includes, that we get distracted. We don't really think about our deepest priorities. But one of the key factors is around responsibility and whether we take responsibility or not. So this is why, the part of why we don't act so much is precisely because we think it's not my responsibility, right? Like, that's not something that I'm supposed to be doing. When we take responsibility, then we do feel like, okay, yeah, I've got to do these things. But as long as we think that's you, that's not me, right? We can avoid these kinds of actions. So a lot of what Menzi talks about in other Confucians is just kind of basic things on taking responsibility. And so I have just a kind of series of quotations on that I put together. So I'll just kind of read through them and give a little bit of context, right? So the most common thing the Confucians say is to take responsibility for yourself. That's the most basic thing. So these are all quotations actually from the Analects, from Confucius. So the noble seek it in themselves, petty people seek it in others. To attack our own badness, but not attack the badness of others, is that not the correct way? Is that not the way to correct our hidden faults? The master said, on seeing the worthy, think of equaling them. On seeing the unworthy, turn inwards and examine yourself. That last quotation to me is the one I like the most, and that's the most interesting, because you might suspect that on seeing the worthy, you should think, oh, they're really great. And on seeing the unworthy, think, that's really a terrible person, right? But what Menzi says is in both cases, the focus should be on yourself, right? When you see someone who's good, you should think, how can I be like them? But when you see someone who's bad, instead of thinking, oh, they're bad, you should think, yeah, maybe I'm like that. Like, do I have those characteristics? Or think, that person's being bad, but is that partly my fault? I mean, like, am I triggering something in them? Is there something I could do about it? Those kinds of questions. So that comes in the second quotation that I put here. And this one is from Menzi. So he says, if you care for other people, but they do not cherish you, turn back and examine your benevolence. If you manage other people, but they are not orderly, turn back and examine your wisdom. If you treat other people with propriety, but they do not respond, turn back and examine your reverence. When actions do not attain results, always turn back to seek it in yourself. If the self is correct, the world will come home to you. So this idea that inevitably you will succeed if you're genuine, that's, I think, naive. And I don't think he really means that, right? I think his point is, normally, if we're in a situation where somebody's giving us a hard time, our immediate reaction is to blame them and not to take responsibility. So his point is to counteract our normal bias. We want to think, okay, well, what am I doing in this situation? Like, how am I contributing to this situation, right? So that, I think, is a form of taking responsibility. So on the one hand, it's counteracting our normal bias we have. On the other hand, it's, how are you going to fix the situation? Blaming the other person, telling them they're responsible, that's not going to do anything to fix the situation, right? Whatever the reality of who's responsible is, the most likely way to change it is to say, what can I do to change the situation, right? Is to take responsibility for it. I think that's why he takes this orientation with it. Here, this one might seem not as clearly to the point, but it's Menzi describing a king that he's been advising who hasn't really become that good. And Menzi says it's not really surprising that he hasn't become much wiser. Even the most easily growing thing in the world, if you give it 1 day of warmth and 10 days of cool, cannot grow. I rarely see the king, and when I withdraw, those of the cool arise. Though I succeed in bringing out some buds, what of that? What's significant here is that we would tend to think, well, this is the king's responsibility, right? I mean, the king needs to become a good person and needs to take responsibility. But Menzi's view is the king doesn't even have the wisdom to figure out what he would need to do. And so what happens in that situation? Well, on the one hand, we could just blame the king, blame the king's advisors, and it'll just stay bad and go downhill. The only other alternative is what Menzi does, which is he takes responsibility, right? He says, okay, the only way that this is going to get fixed is if somebody comes in and makes the effort to change the situation. And so this is a case where normally he would say, you got to take responsibility for yourself. Here he's saying, you got to take responsibility for other people too, because that's the only way that things will change. That's the only way that things can work out. And so this is then the last one that I'll give. So this is going back to Yin, the guy who was in the first set of passages, the first quotation that I had. And so Yin, it's actually a long story. Yin was living out in the woods basically by himself, probably in a village, not by himself. He had a family and stuff, but he was kind of off the grid, we might say. And he was kind of a moral purist. So he was off the grid saying, I'm not going to do anything immoral. Like, I've got my rules, I do my stuff, I'm not, not going to corrupt myself at all. And this guy Tong was rising up to try to bring back order. China was in chaos and there was a rebellion going on, all this. And he kept sending people to Yin saying, come help me, come help me, come help me. And Yin kept saying, I don't care about your gifts. I don't want rewards. I'm not going to get involved with this. And then Yin thought, instead of thinking about the past and these past sages and how good they were, wouldn't it be better to try to make that become a reality now, right? He says, isn't it better to see these things for myself? And then he says, heaven gives birth to the people, making those first to know, wake up those later to know, making those first to awaken, wake up those later to awaken. I am among the first of heaven's people to awaken. I will use this way to wake up this people. If I do not wake them up, who will? And I think for the Confucians, and maybe just in general, in thinking about responsibility, it's that last line that's so crucial. So the key question for them is not who's really at fault here. The key question is who can fix this? Right. And if that's, if not you, then who? That's what Menzi is saying here, right? And this is what Yin thought. If not me, then who? So, I mean, maybe if there is someone else, you can say, okay, well, you do it, right? But generally, right, this falls on whoever, as he says, who has woken up, right? Who can do it? And if, a king can't do it, then you got to go and you got to advise the king. Okay, so these are just, I guess, samples of the kinds of things Confucians say about taking responsibility, and I will stop there. And I'm happy to discuss, hear your thoughts on it, ask your questions about it, more broadly things about Menzi, whatever you guys want to talk about is perfectly fine with me.
Thank you so much. As I was hearing you talk about these different figures in Chinese history and hearing them talk about what they would take responsibility for, it was interesting to me that G, if he saw someone in the world starving, he would feel as if he himself were starving them. And you said, I think he's the father of agriculture. And then you, if he saw someone in the world drowning, as if he would feel as if he himself were drowning them. He was responsible for, what was his job?
For flood control.
Flood control.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so and you also mentioned that idea for yourself of if you drop a piece of trash on the beach and it blows away in the wind, you're dashing after this little paper or plastic bag to try to catch it, even though you're running past all these other pieces of trash and leaving them in place, right? And so this idea of whose responsibility is it? And it seems to me that there's this great practicality also that we see in Chinese thought. I can't actually do every single thing in the world. I can't pick up every single piece of trash on the beach, but I can pick up the piece that I dropped. Maybe G, who was in the father of agriculture, wouldn't feel the same way about necessarily that he was personally drowning someone if he saw them drowning, because he's in charge of agriculture, whereas you was in charge of preventing flooding or controlling the floods. So there's this certain specificity of what we feel responsible for is what it is within our capacity to do something to help. And I was thinking of this this Hindu concept of dharma and svadharma, which means like one's self-duty. And there is a quote by Krishna saying that the duty of another is full of danger. He really advises one to do one's own duty, to do one's own dharma, and yet the duty of another is full of danger. And so I was wondering about this way that we might be able to determine what is actually our personal responsibility to do, since we are finite beings and we cannot do everything in the world that we would love to be able to help. And
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, for monks, for all of the Confucians, and maybe for all, well, maybe not all Chinese philosophers, but all of the Confucians at least, they are really focused on what particular roles you have, right? So your responsibilities will always start from, for them, your family roles, right? So for your family, and then expanding beyond that, and then if you're a teacher, that's going to be specific roles. So they tend to focus on like where concretely do you fit into these relationships, and that's supposed to be your starting point. In terms of like finding what your particular contribution is, I'm trying to think if they say that much about it. So they, on the bigger picture, I think there's two things come to mind, but this doesn't get exactly to that question. But one is, they always think that you should start with what is close and what is small, right? So the first step of taking responsibility is not to see everyone is drowning as your responsibility, but to extend it beyond what you currently see it, and do those kinds of easy, close things. Because they do think that if you think about like, well, how do I stop global climate change or something, it's easy to think like, there's nothing I can do. I have no idea what to do. But if you look instead at like close local things, it's easy to find things that can matter and that can work. And so they often criticize people for trying to look at these like big picture things and not just look like, okay, maybe you can't do anything about that, but you can help people more than you're helping people now in your local place. And so in that way, they don't necessarily say, how do you figure out what in that place, which is the specific thing you should do, but that you should start by just looking like, well, what, like what's really around you? What relationships are you already in? What roles are you already playing? So there's that side of it. The other side is that they do almost always, their advice is you could be doing more than you're doing now. So there are some times when they will say you have to recognize the limits of what you can do, and you have to accept it and say, this is just fated. This is it. Like I can't do any more than this. So they do recognize that. But I think their view is that psychologically, we almost always tend to let ourselves off the hook. And so just kind of strategically, the advice usually is, yeah, you could be doing more than you're doing right now. Even though, there are other times when they'll recognize like, no, like sometimes you need to tell someone you did everything you could and you have to accept the results and not be upset about the results because you did everything that you could. And so they have this, and one thing I like about them that is very practical is it's these kind of practical strategies. So they will have like opposite advice. It's like some advice will be, you got to just work harder. And if you work hard enough, it will happen. But then other times they'll say, you've got to accept some things that's fated and outside of your control. And I think philosophically that looks like a contradiction, but I think practically that's quite normal. Like we would tell someone, you got to work harder, it all depends on effort. Or we would say to someone, you did all you could and you got to accept the results, and I like that about their philosophy.
What struck me is what is very interesting about that question of what is our responsibility. It depends upon whether you're a good person or not, a great person or a petty person. I mean, it doesn't come down to what is my responsibility, but really, what is my character? Mencius basically said, human beings are good. Doesn't mean they're good. It means they have the potential to be good. He talked about these seeds. I'll just mention two. We have a seed that if we saw a small child about to fall into a well, we would feel something, the heart of empathy a little bit. We may not do anything, but we would feel something. And eventually, if you nurtured that seed, you would have reciprocity. You would care about other people. He said, same thing, if you feel a little bit of shame, even something, if you ever blushed, then that's the seed that if you nurtured it, you would have a sense of order, of proper doing, of li, of what it is that should be done. So it's kind of interesting to me that if you work on your character, you become the kind of person that will do something because that's kind of natural to you as a human being. The key value in some ways for Confucianism is Ren, human-heartedness. But we don't start off with that. As a matter of fact, the other Confucian at the same time, Xuanzu, said, hey, we're really not good, and we're like a piece of twisted wood. We have to twist it back into shape to become good. Doesn't matter. We still have to work on ourselves. Doesn't matter if you've got these seeds. Their seeds are fragile, and if you didn't get the proper upbringing, it's harder and harder to nurture them. Anyway, that to me is like the heart of it, is that how much have you nurtured yourself to be the kind of person that has responsibility matters more than what is your responsibility.
Yeah. And I think that's, where taking responsibility is the key more than what is the responsibility there, right? But do you take responsibility and how? And I think, so one of the things in this question of growing the seed for Menzi is he sometimes talks about it in terms of pushing or extending, right? And it's because I think part of the issue is that he thinks we generally naturally have these feelings in like kind of close in, like with our family or with the child. If you see this child in danger, you're going to feel that way. But as it gets further out, we don't. So like if I know there's some child in danger somewhere in the world, I don't feel the same way as if I see a child in danger, or the way I feel toward my family isn't how I feel toward people who are not my family or further out. And so I think that the responsibility aspect is this is what I'm thinking, is it's not just that if you cultivate yourself, you become responsible, but it's part of extending oneself, is trying to think, okay, I'm making excuses here by saying I'm not responsible. Really, I could look at it as being responsible, and then I would feel more there. So it's almost, so I agree with completely what you're saying, but it's almost kind of like a reciprocal thing. You know, and as you get more cultivated, then one way to cultivate yourself is to think about when you do and don't feel responsible and try to extend that. You know,
Well,
I think that's, yeah.
yeah, just as an example, say I was in an archery contest and I come in second. Now, there's two ways I could think about it. One is, if that guy who came in first, if I had, sabotaged his arrows or something, in other words, if something had happened to him, I would be the best. That's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it would be if I worked more at myself, if I tried to become more like him, if I emulated his work ethic or whatever it was, if I worked more on
Mhm.
myself, then I would be better. I mean, there's two ways you can kind of do it. You can blame him for coming in first, because if not, you would have won. Or you can say, well, I needed to work on myself more. So, I mean, it's just more of a character development of polishing those stones.
Thank you, Bob. Let's see what David has to say here.
Um, Frank, good to see you. I'm
Yeah,
wondering,
good to see you.
I'm back to studying psychology, and it sounds like you're saying that Menzi kind of echoes, or actually maybe Maslow and Rogers are echoing this notion that there is an internal urge to grow. It's the notion of the needs hierarchy, that there is something very human about this desire to actualize. And I'm wondering if do you see a connection between those thoughts?
Could you explain a little more the specifics? So it's been a while since I've looked at that.
Yeah. So Maslow's needs hierarchy says that there's certain lower level needs must be filled before you can rise to the next layers. But up near the top, after you've kind of gotten your life together, there's still an urge, something human that makes us want to do better, to become more, to serve something greater than oneself. And I think that's what both Rogers and Maslow were saying, is that there is a innate human drive, and I think this relates to Menzi's idea that we are basically good. I'm wondering if that's. I know there are a couple of therapists in the room as well that might reflect upon that.
Yeah, in terms of Menzi's view, that seems right. And one of the things, so I mean, he does think generally that if we don't have our basic needs met, it's going to be very hard to develop these character traits. I mean, he does say that, first people will sacrifice their lives for certain kinds of things, but he also says if you don't have a constant livelihood, very people will have a constant heart if they don't have a constant livelihood. And I think his idea is, if you're constantly worried about survival, this like takes up all of your attention. And so these broader questions about making the world better, like you can't focus on them as much. On the higher levels, Menzi does think that we always want to go further, that there's an impulse to always go further. I have to say, that's where I have my own doubts about it. I think he has a very good account of why we should be pretty good, and why being pretty good makes our lives better, for like it's more enjoyable, richer lives, But he really thinks we should push and push and push toward being a sage, because we all have this same nature, and in that way he does think it's fundamental to being human that we have this tendency to always keep growing, keep extending our influence. There's a small Confucian text called The Great Learning, the Da Shui, and it actually connects to what Renee was saying in the beginning about like where do we find our position, and how how much responsibility do we take. But it's very famous and starts with the progression, where basically you first have to cultivate yourself, and then then you cultivate your family, and if that goes well, you can cultivate the state, and if that goes well, then you work toward world peace. And I don't think it really thinks like you do one and then the next and the next. You kind of work on all of them, but the idea is if you want to, your goal is world peace, you need to start by making yourself, working on your character, right? And if you want to do the, if you want to bring world peace, like, well, start by like the community around you and fix them, like make that better, and then expand and expand and expand. But he does think that our drive is always to expand it to that highest level, to try to save the world, and that's fundamentally human.
There was one other thought, this notion that taking other people's responsibility has great danger, I think is somehow I heard it. And I was thinking from the therapeutic model, a friend came to me recently, was having relationship issues, and I felt my tendency to like give advice. And and that's apparently quite a no-no in the therapeutic community. It's like, create an environment where they can find the answers for themselves. Whereas taking on the responsibility of the other, it really is a dangerous path. And I kind of see some parallels between his thoughts on that and how we should be with other people's issues.
I'd like to find out from kind of a everyday living standpoint, maybe raising children, being with those who are closest to us, what people's thoughts are on this idea of taking responsibility, encouraging others to take responsibility, helping, for example, children figure out what their responsibility is. It's in a, kind of everyday practical experience.
I was thinking of compassion, because compassion is feeling the pain of another person so that you can help them. So that was what struck me. And obviously, I also appreciate what you said about if you're worried about where you're going to get your next meal from, you can't be worried about the problems of the world. And it seems like there's a lot of people that like to make comments and stuff, but they're not walking in my shoes. They're not going through what I'm going through, but I still feel to be patient and to be compassionate, because I don't know what problems they've been through. So we're all works in progress.
Could I ask Kirk, in terms of raising a teenage son, what kind of practical experience do you have in helping sort through this question of taking responsibility?
Well, having the feeling that I've stumbled my way through the process and learned a lot. I think it's a complex question, and there's no easy answer. I think that's part of what one of the takeaways today, that because, for example, I think you mentioned this, Renee, that part of watching a child grow up is learning not to do everything for them, right? At a very young age, they need to have most things done for them. But as they grow older, more and more, you have to step away and let them fail and let them make their own choices and decisions, even though you may utterly disagree with the direction or hope dearly that it was some other direction they were taking, because they need to discover it for themselves. And also the painful discovery that you may not have known the best direction for them. You may have been wrong. So it seems that one of the things so that's one aspect of it, is knowing when to step away. And I think that even the sage, one of the key phrases that came to mind also during the talk was it's from The Voice of the Silence, this passage where it says that the sage knows when not to disrupt the flow of karma, right? There's cases in which karma needs to play itself out in a person's life in order for them to learn something. So that kind of goes along with the same idea on a larger scale. But I think that the Gandhian perspective, which maybe this is part of what Menzi was getting at, is that when you see evil in the world, when you see someone being drowned by another person, maybe you can dive in and do something about it physically, but maybe you can't. Maybe you're just a witness to it. And on the day of the internet and of television, we see all kinds of things going on in the world which we can't actually do something about. But we can search for those you could say those evil roots in ourselves, those character flaws, those seeds of violence or of hatred or of judgmentalism, of racism, etc., that we may be harboring in ourselves, and root them out. I think that was just also fundamentally a Gandhian perspective, and that there are little things that we can do in our own lives that will make a difference to the collective, sort of like the yeast that just a little bit can leaven the whole lump. So there's a few comments for you.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad for your reminder of Gandhi. I thought of him during Frank's presentation as well, when if something were to go wrong in the ashram, that he had established, if one of his ashramites or one of his followers in his nonviolent campaigns were to do something wrong, he always took personal responsibility for it. And he would often fast and penance for what that person had done. He felt as if they were in some way like a child to him, or he had personal responsibility for them since they were following his way. And so he would do something to try to counteract what they had done. It felt like in order to kind of pique that person's conscience. Oh, Bapu, which was many people's name for him, like Papa. Bapu is fasting for 3 days because of something that I said, because of something I did. Oh my gosh, I really have to, look at myself. I have to now I need to take responsibility because he's taken responsibility for me. And so thank you for that reminder of Gandhi, because it does seem relevant with this concept of taking responsibility.
The talk was very interesting. There were phrases like, you have to perceive someone in a certain way, to see the world in the right way. And then it really came down to the heart. I don't know Chinese philosophy, but I heard that mentioned a couple of times. So what might this all mean? And it may mean, and how is this related also to action? Because it was very interesting how the point was being made about how all this is nothing unless you really act. It isn't a matter of just assuming responsibility or half-heartedly, but actually acting in a certain way. And I think Gandhi's an example of that, for example. And it seems that from my understanding, if it hits you in the heart is universal. It's not, the heart has really nothing to do as much with names and forms and personalities. It's more impersonal. Now, that doesn't mean you disregard a particular person's tendencies or something like that. but you try to not focus just on the personality of the person, which is the outer mask. Persona means mask, but something broader. And in my limited experience, when you're focused on something universal, something impersonal, something that goes beyond the personality, you're going to act because you're not in the world of separate objects. You're not in the world of simply strategic calculation. There's something impelling you, like Gandhi, for example, this good, to be good, even though you're going to err. But you're going to see the world on a different plane of consciousness. Sometimes it's called the higher self in some religions or traditions. But that's a whole different way of perceiving, seeing the world in the right way, a more universal way, than just being on mine and thine or calculating chess moves. Although at some point you need to do that. You need to use reason, but it's really using your heart's intuition, and that energy and that light that comes from the heart will light up your mind. It lights up the mind. And that's what impels you to action, I think. So those are just some thoughts I had. It was very interesting and subtle, these quotations. So I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I'm seeing the time, and I thought I'd like to ask Frank if he'd like to make any final comments, maybe something even that you garnered, Frank, from the conversation with those of us here. And
so I just want to thank everyone for the really thoughtful comments. And the thing I'm going to go away thinking about the most, I think, is, Renee, you're asking people like really concretely, like how would this work? You know what I mean? And thinking like really concretely, when do people take responsibility and when not? Or when do I take responsibility and when not? You know, and try to really think concretely, like of examples. I think that's yeah, because I don't want to fall into being like a philosopher and talking about these things in just too theoretical of a way, you know, and think like what where does this really come down to? So I think that's maybe the thing I'm most thinking about right now, you know, is what would be like some real examples. What am I really talking about? You know, but I just want to thank everybody for the comments. It was really fun to hear what everyone thought about it.
well, I certainly think you do take these things very personally and concretely with your chasing your plastic bag down the beach example. I know, Frank, that you are somebody who is giving so much of yourself in so many ways, and you are really seeking, it seems to me, for example, with the newest book that you've brought out that you focus on Menzi in, on how do we make these philosophical principles and these philosophers from so long ago that so many people in the world have never heard about, how do we make them relevant in our daily lives? How do we take their thought from thousands, hundreds of years ago and find a way to make those thoughts come to life in the way that Maurice was talking about, that when we bring this heart energy, then that awakens the mind, and then that impels us into action. And I feel as if, Frank, you do such a wonderful job in bringing up examples that really do touch the heart. And that doesn't always happen in philosophical discussion. And so you do a wonderful job at bringing that heart quality to what otherwise could be a very dry, analytical kind of conversation. So we're just so grateful that you came to visit us again, and we welcome you as soon as you can come back.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the comments. It's really, very nice to hear, because that's what I'm trying to do. So yeah, thank you very much.